Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the UBC Learning Circle. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to welcome the Northern First Nations Biobank project, or initiative rather, to the circle today. They're going to chat with us a little bit more about how the biobank works and how the project or how the initiative is going so far. I'll let them all introduce themselves a little bit later on, but we're really excited to have the team join us today. Before we get into anything else, I'd like to acknowledge that we at the Learning Circle are zooming in from the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle, allowing us to have conversations just like this. So quick trigger warning for those that it is relevant for today. Sometimes, our conversations within topics can be triggering, or they can be emotionally salient. If that's you for today, please make sure that you're looking after yourself. If you need to talk to an elder or a friend, a family member, or a counselor, please access your support network, whatever that looks like for you. So introductions, very, very briefly. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chowethel First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today, learning alongside all of you. Other Learning Circle team members in the room today, but off camera, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Winona, our program assistant. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Dr. Karone, and we'll get started.
Thanks so much, Cole. It's always a pleasure to be part of the Learning Circle and to see the team of the Learning Circle and those behind the scenes. Ani, to all of you that have joined us this morning, and to those who join the video of this later on when it suits your schedule and your life in these really challenging times. My name is Nadine Karone. I'm a member of the Secwepemc First Nation. I am a member of the Northern Biobank Initiative team, which is growing, but we do have some of our key members that are going to be joining us today. And my thanks to all of those behind the scenes, especially many students and community members who have been a part of this project from its inception. I would like to also acknowledge that this is a challenging time. COVID and the opioid crisis, in addition to the standard challenges that we face as First Nations peoples on a daily basis. The recent release of the In Plain Sight report with respect to racism targeting Indigenous peoples in our BC and Canadian healthcare system. It's a challenging time, and I hope that we support each other and find a safe space and create safety for all of us. So Cynthia, if I can ask you to post the PowerPoint. Great. So next slide, please. The Northern First Nations Biobank has a great team. You've heard about me already. The next slide. Elder Will Fadam has been with our project and is a member of our advisory, which you'll hear about a little bit later. He sends his regrets. He is in the thick of things, dealing with the opioid crisis, the vaccine issue and the COVID crisis, in addition to other tasks that he has with his First Nation. So he won't be joining us today, but he's certainly here in spirit. Next slide, please. Trish Howard will be joining us. She's going to be a panelist at the end of this conversation so that questions can be directed to Patricia Howard as well, who is the regional lead from the First Nations Health Authority on the Northern Biobank Initiative, but she also plays significant roles in primary healthcare and in the Northern region. Next slide, please. Dr. Mac Chongo is with us today. He's the research manager for the First Nations Health Authority Chair in Cancer and Wellness. So works with me daily on working to address challenges and opportunities in research in cancer and wellness. He's a family doctor and has had extensive work working with Indigenous populations across the globe, and is a former postdoctoral fellow in medical genetics. Next slide, please. Dr. Victor Danenko is our research program manager for the actual creation of the infrastructure of a biobank in northern BC. He joined us from Saskatchewan and is a molecular biologist by training. And he is, out of everyone that's been mentioned, an individual that's been on the team the longest. Next slide, please. Megan Hunt is Provincial Executive Director of Primary Healthcare and eHealth with the First Nations Health Authority. She's also been instrumental from the beginning with respect to the Northern Biobank Initiative and the Northern First Nations Biobank. And hopefully she'll be joining us, but obviously with her large portfolio and the COVID crisis, we'll be crossing our fingers that she's able to join for the question and answer period. Next slide, please. So often when you're talking about a Northern Biobank initiative, before talking about the initiative, you have to figure out what a biobank is. This was not something that I knew. So it's a perfectly good question to start off this talk. So what is a biobank? It's a tool to answer research questions. So basically it is a database for systematic storage of clinical data. So data about an individual who has a health condition, a health diagnosis, where the data is collected, everything from age to what type of health issue it is. So a lot of times during this talk, I'll be referring to cancer, and for two reasons. As I'm a surgeon that works primarily on cancer diagnoses, whether I'm diagnosing cancer during procedures or actually treating it with surgery. So it's the area that's closest to me in terms of the patients that I see and the families that I meet, but also in this engagement and consultation process with Northern First Nations in British Columbia. Cancer was repeatedly the top clinical priority when things were being brought up, recognizing, of course, that these consultations were done before COVID was actually even known about. But so I'll often refer to cancer. So for example, clinical data in cancer is what type of tumor, how big was it, how many lymph nodes had it spread to, what kind of treatment had been done, was radiation done, was chemotherapy done, what kind of surgery was done, that kind of clinical data. There's also systematic storage of the biospecimens. So if this is a biobank to deal with cancer and to perform cancer research, the biospecimens would be things like the actual tumors that were taken out and the blood related to that tumor and where it came from. Next point. So the data and the tissue that is in a biobank is often already collected. So for example, the tumor in a biobank that is being built for cancer research, it has been taken out for the purpose of treating the individual with that tumor. And then normally what happens is the pathologist looks at it under the microscope, tells the surgeon and the family doctor and the patient what it was. And then that actual specimen, that tumor, is actually stored for years and years and years in the hospital for legal reasons. So it's stored there, but it's not stored in an organized fashion. So you can't access it readily in order to answer a research question, but it's definitely collected. And in a similar way, your clinical data, like what kind of surgery you got, what kind of tumor it was, what kind of treatment you received, what options were given to you, that's all in your chart in the doctor's office, but it's not in a systematic way for research. It's actually built for what the healthcare system's built for, clinical care. And so this is a biobank is a way to reorganize these things so that it can be used for research. But because it's used for something different than helping someone with a diagnosis, we have to get consent and ethics and governance and security processes and protocols in place so that this is a safe research tool. Next slide, please. So to walk you through this a little bit more, this is seriously how clinical data used to be stored. And I don't want to say how old I am, but essentially, I seriously do have boxes of paper charts of patients that I saw in the beginning of my career, like 15, 16 years ago. Electronic medical records were not used very often anywhere in the country. And so you had paper charts, and then you couldn't throw this data away. This was important. Someone might want to know their history of what surgery they had 10 years ago, and they might not remember, so they'll contact me and I'll try to find that information for them. So it would be stored. It wouldn't be stored in any particular fashion. Going back to the cancer example, it wouldn't be stored with all the breast cancer patients in one box and then all the patients diagnosed with colon cancer in another box. It would be based on the month, based on the year, based on the last time I saw them. Next slide, please. And then electronic medical records, or EMRs, came into play. And then all of a sudden, things looked a lot more neat and tidy. You can almost see these books now, instead of being scattered all over in boxes, these books are pretty easy to find. You can organize them alphabetically, but each book is a person. And each person then has different chapters. Your chapter might be on surgery, and another chapter on medications, another chapter on your allergy status and what medications you have had trouble with, another chapter on what medications you take. All of these books are individual patients, and they're stored in a fashion that are accessible for clinical reasons. So if I wanted to actually do a study, let's say on thyroid cancer, all of a sudden now, I don't know which book has a person with thyroid cancer. It's not organized that way. So it becomes very challenging. Next slide, please. This is sort of a picture of how maybe a biobank does store it. Of course, all this data is stored encrypted, secure, password protected on a computer now. But if you were to take that analogy all the way through, this is your biobank. So now these are stored not based on the individuals, but these are stored based on the disease or the pathology, the concept of what was being treated. So the yellow in the middle, maybe that was breast cancer, and that is a shelf of all breast cancer patients. Maybe the red to the far right, maybe that was stomach cancer. Maybe the green on the bottom right is pancreatic cancer. And so if someone wanted to do research, they could go to the shelf and kind of go, I am looking to do research on breast cancer, and they can go to the yellow books. And they're not going there for information about an individual. They're going there for information and understanding about a disease. Next slide, please. So that's the data. And so, but the data also in a biobank is also collected with the actual specimens, like the tumors, because in the end, the tumors can then be used to get additional information that was never before identified and not really used in Northern BC or in our clinical care. So for example, if this is an example of what we take out in surgery, and this is an example of maybe 200 surgeries and the samples that I take out, you can see here that they're kind of scattered. They're based on when I took them out, the month, the day, the year I took them out. But let's say, again, that they're color coded. Let's say that the yellow are the breast cancer tumors that I take out. Let's say the green are the stomach cancers, or the purple are the pancreatic cancers, or the orange are the kidney cancers. All of a sudden, if I wanted to do a research project looking at stomach cancer, I would have to pick through all of these and find those. And in a hospital and pathology departments where in Northern BC, they're dispersed all over, all of a sudden you can see that it's extremely challenging to be able to do this research in a timely fashion. Next slide. Well, here's the example of how we could reorganize things in a biobank so that they're not stored based on the individual or based on the day or year or month that the specimen is removed. An individual tumor comes out because they have had the surgery to get the cancer treated. That tumor then goes down to pathology. It's evaluated by the pathologist for the purpose of that individual to find out the diagnosis. The diagnosis is shared with the doctors and the individual so that the next treatment or care can be provided and discussed. But then instead of storing it in the old way, in that sort of jumbled box of crayons, it's stored in a systematic way so that in the future, if someone wanted to study a specific type of cancer, you could go to the exact area where these tumors are, and it's a systematic way of storing them. So that if there is a research project, a research question from a community, from a researcher, that there would be the capacity to do this. And that's what a biobank is. Next slide, please. So why do we have biobanks? Well, they are a fundamental tool in health research because sometimes research questions come up and you can imagine how long it would take to go back in time and try to organize data from that jumbled boxes and the specimens from that jumbled bag of crayons into what we now call biobanks. And that type of research is used currently across Canada and across the world in a whole broad array of health research. Everything from predicting drug interactions and what drug would be good for you if you have high blood pressure or if you have an irregular heartbeat, but also for identifying risk of disease. Like if you have family members or lots of community members with a particular disease, again, using cancer, because we do know that there are gene mutations and there are identifiers for high risk of disease, then we can identify those. That would then impact this whole spectrum of care. Who should get screening? When should they get screening? For example, a research study that came out a couple of years ago showed that First Nations in British Columbia are at a higher rate of or risk of getting colon cancer. Well, should we look into that? And is there a role for genomic research, meaning using these tissues in addition to the data to figure out why is there a higher risk of colon cancer? There's a lower survival for cervical cancer in First Nations people in BC compared to the rest of BC. Is there a reason for that that we've never looked into before? So there's a lot of sort of research that could be done in this area. And again, cancer is one example, but it has been applied across the country in various areas: diabetes, autoimmune disease, and there's a big role now in COVID itself. Now, this type of research can be evolved to point of care, and that's pretty relevant. What I mean by that is research, for the most part, when you enter a research project, you're not doing it because you have a guarantee that it's going to help you. It's actually to develop new knowledge, new understanding of the particular topic that's being researched. But there are increasing applications of genomic research where we use the tissue to get the spelling of the tumor using the 4-letter alphabet we call DNA. And essentially, we use it to the point where sometimes we find answers that can actually help the individual that's part of that research. There's no guarantee of that, but this is one area of research where it actually is being applied currently, even here in British Columbia. And there is a growing application of these genomic research findings. Genomic meaning basically taking that tumor, in the case of cancer research, and finding the DNA spelling of it and using those research findings to actually drive clinical care of the individual. We call this precision medicine, meaning that the doctors have an idea of what they might suggest for your treatment based on what it looks like under the microscope. But if they look at the spelling of it that's invisible to the human eye, even with a microscope, then maybe your treatment recommendations would be different. They would be precise based on you as an individual and you as the DNA spelling of who you are and the tumor that is being treated. Next slide, please. So biobanks, a big part of this is why a Northern Biobank? Because we started off also recognizing this is the Northern Biobank Initiative. And so Northern, in this case, referring to Northern British Columbia. The main thing is that biobanks are not new. They are not innovative. They are not unique. There are hundreds and hundreds of biobanks across the country. The main thing is that they're based in Southern Canada. They're based in Southern BC. They're at metropolitan centers, in academic centers. And for the most part, there's a real gap between who has the opportunity and the choice and the equitable access to being part of a biobank. And so what we thought would be, if we created a bank that was located in Northern BC, we could finally represent Northern BC population in this innovative type of genomic research that's happening in Southern Canada. A phrase that's used in Northern BC is in the North for the North. And basically what we're trying to do when we're adding a dimension of biobanking opportunities for more people in British Columbia is to decrease the reliance on what we call generalizability, which means that research being done in large centers, in metropolitan centers, will have more and more applicability that we can prove with research in Northern populations or First Nation populations, because we're part of it. We're actually part of those solutions that are being published in papers, part of those solutions that are being recommended by doctors. So for example, right now, when I see a First Nations patient and I write them a prescription for a diagnosis or an infection or whatever it is, I write them a prescription. I hope that that works, because it is based on research and data and understanding that was generated almost exclusively from individuals that were either not First Nations or did not identify as First Nations for a First Nations specific study. And for the most part, it works. But at which point do we get to have our own answers with our own research, with our own research questions? And having a biobank gets us into this space. Next slide, please. So this is a Northern Biobank initiative. And the reason being is we had to start somewhere. So it's not at the active exclusion of other rural, remote and populations or First Nation populations in BC, but we did start in the North. Now, from those in the audience that know BC, BC has 5 geographic health authorities, and the First Nations Health Authority is a population health authority of First Nations in BC that mirror the sort of the geographic borders of those geographic health authorities, including Vancouver Coastal, Vancouver Island, but the one we're talking about is Northern Health. Now, Northern Health is about 2/3 of the geographic landmass of BC, but only 6% of its total population. It's very sparsely populated because of this massive landmass, and Indigenous populations, primarily First Nations and Métis, make up to 25% of the total Northern Health population, depending on the resource that you're looking at. And of course, we know there's a significant percentage of First Nations in Northern Health, and it is the health authority with the greatest percentage of First Nation peoples that the health service serves. Next slide, please. Next point. So why do we need one in the North? We already sort of went over this. Next point. One, there's some big major points like equity. For the most part, biobanks have existed for decades. Genomic research is escalating. The benefits are changing healthcare as we speak. Quite frankly, we deserve it. We deserve the access to choice. That includes Northern, First Nations, rural and remote communities, that we have the opportunity to drive research questions and have our voices heard. And in this perspective, I'm talking about as a First Nations physician, a First Nations researcher that lives in the North and services communities, and I get to meet families and patients from rural and remote communities and from the First Nation communities surrounding the Prince George area where I live. And then the main thing is choice. Recognizing that once we create this, every individual has a choice whether they want to be part of it or not. But right now, there is no choice. And that is wrong, in our opinion. Next slide. So you can see here that for the most part, the biobanks in British Columbia are based in the Vancouver area almost exclusively. And there are some biobanks on the island in Victoria. But for the most part, metropolitan centers, including the BC Cancer Agency in Vancouver. What we're proposing is that we have a Northern Biobank based on the Lheidli traditional and unceded territory, also called Prince George, because it's the tertiary care center in the healthcare system, that we house it there. That would serve the Northern Caucus or the Northern First Nations in BC and the population in Northern British Columbia. Next slide, please. So we know sort of why a Northern First Nations biobank, why a Northern biobank, to serve and address equity, to provide choice, to make things possible. But why a First Nations biobank? Well, I think we have to consider this to be a component of the Northern Biobank Initiative. First of all, it would have all the benefits of a biobank that we've just talked about, all the purposes or rationale behind it, but it would have the ability to apply the research and the research findings more readily to First Nation populations. The governance structure would be specific to First Nations direction and input. It would be Indigenous led, because that's what we do with our data. And that's what we do in terms of capacity building. The process of consent, communication, decisions on utilization and access will also be Indigenous led. That's the governance structure. And there are examples of this evolving globally, meaning that we're working with international partners, the Maori in New Zealand, Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, multiple examples of efforts being made in Native American and Native Hawaiian communities. So this initiative is moving with an Indigenous view globally, and we want to be part of that in terms of potentially creating this First Nations Biobank. Next slide, please. So the Northern Biobank Initiative started, and there are multiple partners, but the one we're going to focus on today is really the First Nations Health Authority, and their component is really the First Nations Biobank. But we do have multiple other funders and partners, including Genome BC, Northern Health, PHSA, and the BC Cancer Foundation. Next slide, please. So the objective of the NBI, or Northern Biobank Initiative, was to basically create a biobank, that concept we were talking about, in a geographic location where none existed, in a healthcare system and health authority with minimal history of clinical research that did not do any of this type of biomedical research, in a hospital, the University Hospital of Northern BC, that was not used to facilitating health research, and with a population that did not really realize what was happening in metropolitan academic centers. Many, we've done focus groups and qualitative research with family doctors and with community members. And it's really, if it's not happening and you're not being offered these opportunities, people don't realize what is down in metropolitan centers or at other centers across Canada that might be available to them for research or clinical care. So we started to know this, and that's the objective was to create a biobank to help address these. Interestingly enough, the aim was also to include the most excluded population, which is the First Nations people. And it's interesting because if you look at where we wanted to create this, in this geographic location, in this health authority, in this hospital, well, First Nations people, upon whose traditional unceded territory this geography and healthcare system and hospital was located, were the most excluded in all of this. So this was a fundamental objective behind the NBI. And it's important for us to sort of try to explain that there's this positive impact about this bench to bedside. And that's basically where the genomic research is done in a lab. Like it's not done at a hospital bedside, but the information and the knowledge that's garnered, hopefully, will generate new treatments, new ways to diagnose, new ways to figure out who should be screened for certain diseases or cancers. And that should be applied to information to treat someone at the bedside. That's really important. And you can hear it, where we hear it the most right now, daily, are the vaccines. Basically looking at all the people working in the labs around the world trying to develop a vaccine. And people are just sort of saying, when do we get it in our arm? Like, when can we get this potentially life-saving initiative into our arm? They want that bench to bedside. What we're saying is, we want to know what bedsides are getting to the bench when it comes to a lot of this research, particularly the cancer research. Next slide, please. So this is a reminder to myself to recognize that a lot of concerns that we heard throughout our consultations were the determinants of health, and not just disparities in cancer rates or cancer survival, but also determinants of health way upstream. And one of the things that I've realized as a researcher and as a physician and as a family member is that access to research itself is a determinant of health. Because if research actually does work and it develops new knowledge and new understanding and new treatments and new ways to diagnose earlier so that people can survive longer, if that is the benefit of research, then surely it should be equitable. It should be equal access for all, and it should be important, meaning that it is a determinant of health. And so if we can address access to research, I think we can address one of the fundamental determinants of health that is often left off the long list, such as things like education or socioeconomic status. Research can actually play a role in determining the benefits of this. Next slide, please. So the NBI, we're on phase 2 now. We've been working with the entire Northern Health population with respect to a retrospective Northern breast cancer biobank. We use breast cancer because it's such an unfortunate common cancer. So there are high rates of breast cancer across Northern Health. But we also, a major focus of phase 2 was consultations and engagement with researchers and biobankers and ethicists about creating a Northern Biobank with the public across the North, including community events and university presentations, But a big part, and the part we're going to focus on today, is the consultations and engagement and partnership building with First Nations in Northern BC within the FNHA Northern region. Next slide, please. So the objectives of these consultations with the First Nations in Northern BC was, first of all, to provide awareness and education among First Nations people in Northern BC on the basic terms and concepts of biobanking, genomic research, so that individuals and family members and patients could be a part of this dialogue. It's really important. It was important for us to recognize and really important to share that the objective too was to make this reciprocal, because there are times when it was our responsibility to do presentations to increase awareness and education about biobanking. And there are times where our fundamental role as the NBI team was to sit back, not speak, and listen, so that we could hear expectations and concerns and potential solutions about ethics or consent procedures, access to the biobank, governance, protocols of a First Nations biobank to be established within the NBI, so that we could learn what the communities wanted, needed, expected, what chiefs, what health directors, what the leadership expected from us. And in that way, it was reciprocal, and we learned a ton. And today, I'd like to share with you what we learned so far. Next slide. So first of all, you know, it's been well understood right from before really the FNHA started, but certainly afterwards, that the adage of nothing for us without us is paramount in all of this. And the FNHA has been at the table since before this biobank project started, because before we started it, we asked if it was something that they thought it was worthwhile pursuing, because why start something if it isn't something that's a priority, something that's supported by the potential partners that you are hoping to work with. Ultimately, after years of discussion, formally and informally, there was a resolution passed at the Northern Caucus that the First Nation chiefs voted on for actual creation of a Northern First Nations biobank. So this was done within the Northern Caucus. They did state that they wanted us to establish a Northern First Nations Biobank Advisory Committee to assist us in the consultation process. And that was a critical piece of that we had to create before proceeding with the consultations. And then that advisory committee that would then help us with how to do the consultations, who to involve. The how was a critical piece of it. But in this resolution, the First Nation chiefs did support the concept of the First Nations Biobank. So we're going to work with chiefs and health directors and the FNHA leadership to figure out how to receive input from First Nations across Northern BC on entities such as governance, access, consent, protocols of a First Nations biobank that would be embedded within this sort of broader concept of a Northern biobank. But First Nations biobank would be something different and something unique. Next slide, please. So our advisory have been incredibly helpful, have given significant amount of time and wisdom and effort and commitment to this, and we can't thank them enough. The top three on the left, Beverly, Clifton Percival, Don George, and Sarah Gauthier, were voted in at their sub-regional caucuses to be representatives on the biobank from their sub-regions. And that was incredibly critical to make sure that the geographic representation was there for those nations. Dr. Laura Arbour is a researcher in Indigenous health and a medical geneticist who has served as a physician in Northern British Columbia in First Nation communities for the majority of her career, and she's spent about 3 decades in research in this area. Maui Hudson is our international Indigenous representative on the advisory. He is Maori and lives in New Zealand and has visited Northern BC 3 times so far, I believe, to do presentations and to meet community members. And he's working in the field of Indigenous genomics in New Zealand, making sure that the Maori also are winning this fight towards equity and access to genomic research in a safe and respectable and cultural way. Of course, we've already talked about Will Faldham. We'll miss him today. Nicole Cross, Megan Hunt, Patricia Howard are all within the Northern region and have played critical roles in supporting the Biobank initiative. Both Nicole and Megan were leads on this at various points, and Trish Howard has played a critical role with this when Megan Hunt moved over to her provincial director role. Namaste Marsden is based in the Vancouver office for the First Nations Health Authority and has been a major source of wisdom and input. And then David Lowen has been the regional director and the input from the Northern Health with respect to Indigenous perspectives. Next slide, please. So the consultations were basically twofold. One was key informant interviews, where it was recommended to us that we do interviews with chiefs, health directors, or individuals that they appoint that would have specific information that would be helpful for the communities that they work with. And there were 32 key informant interviews that were performed over this period of time. And then focus groups were performed, 7 of them, with a total of 44 participants, branched out in North Central, Northwest, and Northeast. And you can see the communities here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that distribution, but it's important to recognize the location, the participants, and the communities in the surrounding area that had people participate were really guided by community coordinators, health directors, and community leaders to ensure that they tried their best to get people at the table who would be interested, but would give varied perspectives. And then we had, we looked at all of the information from looking at themes that were emerging and voices to really get an idea of where we should go next at the completion of the consultations. Next slide, please. So if you look at the characteristics of the key informants, these are the chiefs or health directors. You can see that it's pretty well distributed amongst the 3 subregions based on the populations. And then on the right-hand side, you can see roles of the key informants. About 30% were chiefs, over 40% were health directors, and the other made up the rest. And they were council members or community health nurses, people that would have health in their portfolio, that either chiefs or health directors said, hey, you should really talk to this person. They're going to have important things to say. Next slide, please. This is a map of the northern region, and you can see this is a nice pictorial view of the distribution of the key informant interviews. I want to draw your attention to the upper left side, which is the true north or the northwest, and you can see that there was no representation in the key informant interviews. And the reason for this was the consultation phase of the MBI extended into the forest fire season. In fact, our team was in the Northeast and had to pull back because of safety reasons to going into those communities. The chiefs and the health directors and community members have expressed interest in the NBI, but they did state that they could not undertake any of the focus groups or the key informant interviews because of the crisis that they went through and are currently still surviving from, especially with the additional pressures of the other public health crises that we're facing as a province. Next slide, please. So when we talked to key informant interviews, over 80% had already heard about the biobank before the interview. And I think this is a representation of how the caucus structure worked. So next slide. You can see here is how did the key informant interviews hear about it. And you can see that between the regional caucus meetings and the sub-regional caucus meetings, that was a big part of it. Almost 75% of the chiefs had heard about it through that way. And then it was a smattering of different ways. There's a documentary done on the NBI. There were posters in communities. Maui Hudson played a big role because of his 3 trips up here. And he's just a dynamic speaker and a wonderful advocate for Indigenous representation in health research. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we asked them is it important for First Nations people to be able to participate in biobanking and genomic research? And 100% of the key informants said yes. Of the reasons why, 43% said equity. This is one of the main reasons why the NBI exists. If other people have a right to have a choice to say yes or no to this type of research, then our people do too. They also raised concerns with respect to determinants of health and the disparities between First Nations and the rest of British Columbia in terms of determinants of health, whether it's education, socioeconomic status, or otherwise, and how could this be used to help address questions and disparities in health, and can this biobank and this data collection be helpful in that? And then they also raised specific conditions that they thought right off the top of their heads that this biobank could be used for research, and they thought would be used for research. And some of these health conditions in particular, next slide, by far at the top of the list was cancer, with diabetes being mentioned the second most commonly, and then a range of other chronic conditions affecting First Nations people more than others, or identified as a priority within their communities. These were health conditions that were raised. Next slide, please. Key informants also, when we asked them, what do they think the challenges would be of First Nations people participating in this type of biobank and research? And they said right off the top, trust. We needed to build trust, and addressing the egregious examples of where research went wrong was going to be something we would have to address. Making sure that their communities were aware of this by doing things like the Learning Circle. But also we've received lots of input during our consultations about what ways to communicate with the communities to help them be aware of the biobank, so they're not hearing about it for the first time when they're being asked to participate. Access to these opportunities was something that the chiefs and the health directors felt was a concern, just like access to healthcare in general is an ongoing concern. They saw challenges with respect to elders, to making sure that their voices were respected and heard. And that also sort of folded into informed consent, to make sure that that informed consent was real, that First Nations people knew what they were signing up for, and that they felt like they had sources of information that they could trust. And then the social determinants of health, once again, being brought in terms of some of the reasons why this would be a challenge to participate. Really hard to participate if you're really working to put, day to day to get food on the table, to have a job, to the struggles with social determinants that our people face because of the history that our country, that we all, I think, know about. So next slide, please. The key informant also said, when we said, what approaches can we use to address those challenges on the previous slide? By far, the most common was communication, sharing what we were doing, sharing what we found, sharing what our thoughts were. But communication is a two-way street. Listening to what people say, listening to their concerns, listening to their ideas and their solutions. And that's, I think, why we started off in such a helpful way when they guided us in our consultation process. Involving leadership was going to be critical. And building relationships, cultural safety, a non-negotiable. And I think the reason why entities like relationships and involving leadership and cultural safety is not 100% is because I think by this time we had been working with these chiefs and health directors for years about this project, that I think for the most part, I'm hoping trusted our team, that we realized that these kind of things like relationships and cultural safety are simply non-negotiable. It was important, we heard, to involve elders, not just making sure that they felt comfortable in making an informed decision, but elders in the process of how we are moving forward was going to be critical because of the wisdom that they have. Governance was also a main piece of this. It says 5% there, but I think part of the reason why is because for the most part, governance sort of is how communication and leadership and relationships were all going to be folded into. So governance is a key part of it, and we'll talk about it in a bit. Next slide, please. With focus groups, so those were key informant interviews. These were focus groups now, and if you look at the data, similarly well distributed in terms of the 3 subregions. Next slide. And again, you can see this is just a breakdown of the number of community members that came from the engagement area. So it's important to recognize that when we had a focus group in a particular city or community, that people from the surrounding communities were in fact invited and facilitated to come in and compensated with travel accommodation, and to make sure that this was as fruitful as possible to get as many voices as we could. Next slide, please. This is another pictorial map showing the data in a different view. And once again, recognizing the importance of the voices of the Northwest, and that we are going to be reaching out to them to make sure that they remain part of the process, which we've been doing. Next slide, please. Again, about 80% of chiefs and health directors had heard about the biobank, but when we were in communities, only about a quarter of the participants had heard about the biobank before the presentation that they came to. And partly because these people were often not at the caucus meetings or at the regional meetings and weren't chiefs that were getting briefings on this. But I think that a quarter of the people had heard about this project that was based sometimes hundreds of kilometers away is an example of the dialogue that it's stimulating in the community. The NBI presentation that we're referring to is that when individuals signed up to participate in the focus group, one of the steps of the focus group was actually for them to attend a presentation on the Northern Biobank Initiative the night before the focus group. And so this is what we were talking about, because people, even if you weren't part of the focus group, you could certainly come to the community event and celebrate and enjoy the food and the environment and the conversation and be part of that community presentation. Next slide, please. It's interesting because this is just sort of showing over a short period of time how we can go from not even knowing what the heck a biobank is to comfort level talking about it. So this is a bar graph showing how did people rate their knowledge out of biobanking, like what's a biobank or what's genomic research? And on the far left, you can see before the presentation, as they walked in the door, individuals rated their self-knowledge about 1.6 out of 10 on what a biobank is. After a 1 hour presentation with about an hour question and answers, that knowledge doubled or more to about a 4 out of 10. Which was significant after just one presentation. Then when we asked the focus group participants after the focus group, which was a 3 hour focus group with some breaks, the knowledge continued to increase to 5.3 out of 10. And so this was telling us that, you know what, if we do outreach and if we share information about the biobank, that people pick up these concepts pretty readily. And I think it's important because we did something very similar with family physicians in Northern Health. And these are pretty comparable scores in terms of what family physicians said. In fact, some family physicians would say their knowledge on a scale of 1 to 10 was 0. They'd never heard of a biobank. So it's a concept that shows just how marginalized the North is compared to the South, and how we can actually start to be part of this dialogue if we start talking about it and generate our own resources like a biobank. Next slide, please. So when we ask people in terms of how important it is for First Nations people to be able to participate in this type of research, biobanking and genomic research, remember that the chiefs and health directors said that 100% said yes, it's important. For community members, 78% said yes. 18% said yes, but only if, and they had some concerns and ideas to bring to the table. Some did not respond, but I think what we noticed here is that nobody said no. In all of the communities that we went to, nobody said that it is not important for First Nations people to participate. It didn't mean that they wanted to participate. It meant that that choice should be given. Next slide, please. Why is it important? And interestingly enough, the exact same answers started to come through. Chief, health directors, community engagement coordinators, leaders in the community, and community members that were interested in being part of the focus groups. Equity was a big piece. And that really rung true to the NBI team, because that's the whole purpose for why we actually proposed this project to begin with. Health conditions were raised second in the community in terms of conditions that they felt had been plaguing their communities or their families or themselves for generations or for years, and they didn't have the answers to. They wanted to be part of this research. And then determinants of health, once again on the list, just like the chiefs and the health directors. Next slide, please. So guiding principles, like what we did is we took a look at the community focus group participant scripts. So we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of what people were saying and telling us, chiefs, health directors, and there are 8 broad themes that were critical in the development operation of the Northern BC First Nations Biobank. And these are things we're going to have to address as we go through the creation of this. One is recognizing that there's empowerment through communication and knowledge sharing and building on that empowerment. One is the necessity of rebuilding trust in research and ensuring that whatever research is being done using this First Nations Biobank, that the benefits first and foremost are for First Nations people. The next is fostering respectful community engagement, working for enduring partnerships. So we have gotten incredibly positive feedback to date about the community engagement we've done so far. But if this is a biobank that's going to exist for years, that engagement can't stop just because the project's over. This has to continue, and they want to know how are we going to continue to engage with the communities and be open and sharing with the biobank as it exists. These have to be enduring partnerships. And building research capacity. So they want to know, like, if you're going to create a First Nations biobank, then what do our communities, there's going to be roles, there's going to be opportunities. How do our students get involved? How do our students that go to university get involved? Can we help to train First Nation medical geneticists? Can we get First Nations genetic counselors? Can we get more First Nation doctors, researchers out of this? How do we build capacity? Next slide. Cultural safety, basically a non-negotiable and completely understandable by the NBI team. Ensuring equitable research representation and healthcare access. So just because we have the biobank, that's what is needed in order to get equitable representation in genomic research and precision medicine in Canada. But the biobank alone is not going to guarantee it. We need to make sure that we have that commitment from the researchers, from the funding bodies, and from the people that are working in the biobank to make sure that we get that representation and access to the healthcare that research drives. Developing governance and protocols is going to be key, and that's really the next step of the First Nations Biobank. And then finally, the ensuring consent is appropriately managed. And there's going to be consent differences. We've heard from community over and over again. That's going to be different than the standard consent that you may have signed when going into a hospital or getting a medical procedure in the past. Next slide, please. So there's basically community members were talking about challenges of First Nations participation in biobanking. This again is similar to what the chief showed: mistrust, lack of in terms of building that trust back up again. The challenges are going to be control and governance, and setting up a governance structure that makes sense to community members, that's First Nations led and driven. Making sure there's enough information to get informed consent, that awareness and understanding is out there. They said that one challenge is that First Nations people, they said, we don't complain. We don't raise a lot of our concerns in the healthcare system. Sometimes we're not happy with how things are going, but we don't think people will listen to us, so we don't say anything. That is something that we're going to make sure that we need to be aware of, anyone that's part of the NBI, so that we make sure that there's a safe space to bring up concerns and to bring up questions. Cultural elements of this were brought up. And I don't think the 3% really represents the degree to which this is so important when the First Nations Biobank is created. I think that in some ways, it's a way that it was brought up, recognizing that as soon as it was brought up, it was such an obvious part of it that it wasn't talked about as much because everyone knew that it needed to be incorporated into it, if that makes sense. Next slide, please. So how do you approach this in a good way? Same way, community members had similar answers as the chiefs. Communication was by far the most important. Open, transparent, honest communication, and involving community members to be part of it. Cultural safety, again, non-negotiable, and ensuring the consent was done in a good way. Informed consent, not coerced, not because you don't understand something, you sign something that the doctor puts in front of you. We need to have this done in a culturally safe way that makes sense to communities, and give them the time to ponder this, to think about it, and make sure it's something that they do want to participate in. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what we've come up with so far in terms of a governance model. It's important to recognize that this is based on information when we asked about governance from key informant interviews, like the chiefs and health directors, from the regional and sub-regional meetings. So when the dialogue was happening, so there's the chiefs and the health directors that we talk to, but at the sub-regional meetings and regional meetings, there are lots of opportunities to talk to chiefs and health directors and other First Nations Health Authority leadership that we recorded and formally and informally their feedback at formal presentations that were on the agenda of these major packed meetings, that we're so thankful that they would find room for us in these packed agendas, but at the same time, really helpful to getting this feedback. The First Nations Biobank Advisory Committee provided a lot of input throughout the whole process. And a combination of all this led to this governance model, where the inner circle would be those people that would be voting in terms of decisions that need to be made and how questions would be answered and the operations would be decided. So we have the sub-regional representatives that at this point, it's thought probably still elected the same way they were elected onto the First Nations Biobank Advisory from the 3 subregions. A community member that would be appointed. We heard from multiple different community members and chiefs that the importance of a youth member or 2 would be important. And the main reason being twofold. Having youth that were in a university program or hoping to be a scientist or hoping to go into medicine or to healthcare or to policy, this would be an amazing opportunity for them to get their feet wet and to have a voice and to learn skills. But also, we just talked about this whole biobank thing is for future research. And the future research is going to benefit our future generations. So they should be at the table. And it's interesting because the youth I'm spending a bit more time on because it wasn't something that was originally anticipated by the NBI group. And now it seems so darn obvious. And that's why we listened. First Nations Health Authority representation. The North would be critical, but also thought to have at least one person from the provincial level of FNHA to be on the governance. A knowledge holder, because health and research cannot be done without the input from these Indigenous perspectives, which is what will make the First Nations Biobank different than the Northern Biobank, which is a big biobank that serves all of Northern BC. Elders, of course, we heard that it's important, that's an important way of addressing the challenges that we're going to face as we create the NBI. And so having elders' voices and wisdom at the table would be critical. The others are more professional in terms of lawyer, ethicist, physician, genomic researcher. It was said quite clearly that if at all possible, Indigenous, First Nations, and First Nations based in the North would be the best, recognizing, of course, that right now, I'm not aware of an Indigenous medical ethicist in the country. And there's very few genomic researchers that are Indigenous in the country. So we're talking about a really new kind of model, but we need to at least have people that address the understandings of cultural safety, cultural humility, and a passion for the wellness of Indigenous people, and ideally a knowledge of the Northern First Nations communities and acceptance that they are people to be trusted. On the outer circle, on the far right, are people that could be part of the meetings, but wouldn't have a role in the governance, but would be there to serve to answer questions and to address some of the issues that we could be tasked with. That would be the NBI, the biobank steward, that would be based in the hospital, ad hoc experts in areas where the governance board had concerns about, and you could bring in medical geneticists, genomic researchers, and then an international Indigenous representative. It was thought, it was, back and forth, where should someone like Maui Hudson be? And interestingly, ultimately, it was felt that for the most part, very important to have as part of the governance, but not a voting member. And as Maui Hudson said, he can share his perspective as a Maori, as someone in New Zealand, as someone who's tackling a lot of these same sort of challenges, but he cannot in any way understand what Northern First Nations peoples are going through and what their priorities are and how they want to do things. So he'd like to be at the table, but he wouldn't in any way presume to have a voting voice. This governance, ultimately there would be a chair, and that chair would also sit on the scientific advisory. And a scientific advisory council would be basically the Northern Biobank, which is a biobank that would address the disparities that the North in general gets left out of these research opportunities. Well, there's going to be a scientific advisory committee to sort of review the applications for who gets access to that NBI. And there would be a chair of this Northern First Nations Biobank that would be on that Scientific Advisory Council. But the Northern First Nations Biobank would decide themselves who got access to the Northern First Nations Biobank. So in a sense, there's going to be like this Northern Biobank, which is for anyone in Northern BC that is a potential participant. They can say yes or no. But a First Nations person can have an opportunity to be part of what we call the sub-biobank, or a biobank that's specific for First Nations, that will have this different governance, that will have different consent processes, that will have cultural safety embedded into the processes and protocols, that will have elements of cultural knowledge and importance as paramount in the process and protocols. So the First Nations Biobank would be separate and would be governed in this way. So let me see if I can show you in the final, one of the final slides here. So this is, imagine that you're a First Nations person. So if you're a non-First Nations person in Northern BC, you would have an opportunity to be part of the Northern Biobank because you're in the North. You could be part of the Northern Biobank if you are having surgery for something that the Northern Biobank is part of. So that's that. These three individuals are, let's pretend they're First Nations people that are going to have surgery, and let's say it's for a cancer of some type, if we're dealing with cancer as one of the priorities that have been identified by the communities and chiefs. So on the far left, you have a First Nations individual that they hear about the biobank and they just sort of think, you know what, I don't know if I want to be part of the Northern First Nations Biobank, but I really, you know, I've had breast cancer now and I just don't want, I want to solve this breast cancer. I want to be part of the research. I want to be part of figuring out how to treat this because I have two daughters and I just don't want them to go through what I'm going through. They say yes to the Northern Biobank, but they say, I'm not sure I really want to be part of the Northern First Nations Biobank. That's one option. Another option for the middle person, let's say they come in and it's the same person, say an individual that was diagnosed with breast cancer, and they say, you know what, I want to figure out this breast cancer, and they go through the same rationale. I want to be part of the Northern Biobank. But you know what, I think there's something different. You know, there's a lot of people in my community that have had this type of cancer, and or a lot of people in my family. I want this addressed. Is there something about this that's specific to First Nations? So they say, I want to be part of the First Nations Biobank too. So there might be a research question that's looking at breast cancer in BC. And then the biobank could be used, the Northern Biobank could be used for that. But if there's a question about First Nations and breast cancer, then the Northern First Nations Biobank could be used for that. And that individual in the middle would be potentially participating in both. The person on the far right comes in through the doors and gets asked about this. And then essentially, this individual says, you know what, I don't really want to be part of that Northern Biobank. You know, I want to put like all my eggs in one basket. I really want to make sure that I'm part of this Northern First Nations Biobank because I want these questions answered for First Nations. So that's the third option. But remember, there's always another option. And the other option, Cynthia, if you can just click, is you can, these individuals, they get the information, they get the what is a biobank, why are we creating a biobank, why is it there, what can it do, what can it not do, and they just say, you know what, I don't want to be part of any of these, you know, just not my thing. I don't feel safe. I don't feel like I'm interested in it. I don't like research. Whatever their reasons are, you can just walk away and it won't impact your treatment. It won't impact your care. It won't impact any of that. But you do have, and the final word here, Cynthia, is choice. You have a choice. And that's what's different about all four of these individuals or scenarios right now, is right now in the North, as a First Nations person, you don't have any of these choices for the most part. So I think that's what the Northern First Nations Biobank is trying to do. Next slide, please. So the future of where we're at now, those are the consultations we've done. Now we're really working on knowledge translation. And my thanks to the Learning Circle for helping us do it in this way. We're moving forward to phase 3, which is the establishment of the Northern First Nations Biobank. And of course, the next steps in that are, it's really anticipated more and more by the community. So our team is getting like individual emails and phone calls and questions when we run into people about when is this First Nations Biobank going to start? I had surgery 2 months ago. Can you put my specimen in the biobank? Or, my father's having surgery next month. Can he be part of the biobank? So there's rising anticipation of when this is going to get going. But one of the roles to consider for the First Nations Biobank is cancer. We feel that we've heard pretty loud and clear from the communities and chiefs that cancer is really a primary concern and priority for First Nations people. And oncogenomics, which is a fancy word of saying that this type of research is really, really revolutionizing our understanding of cancer and our treatments of cancer to the point that I think it makes sense. But of course, now with COVID, with what we're dealing with, there's a huge role of genomic research in COVID. And is that something that we'd want to be part of in the future? Next slide. But we need some first steps. And those steps are, we need the approval and the establishment of the governance model that I showed, those circles. So that's been approved by the Northern First Nations Biobank Advisory Committee. It's been approved by the Northern Regional Table. But for the most part, we really do need to go through the standard sub-regional meetings and regional meetings. And of course, with the pandemic that we're in, this is lower on the priority list than ensuring the safety and the health and survival of the communities. The processes are set up. What we need to do is make sure that then once we establish the governance, that how the First Nations Biobank is created is done with the governance guidance, and basically they set out the FNHA protocols and ensure that we continue to have First Nations support, input, guidance, and it needs to be done in a safe way. Next slide, please. So going back to the question, like why a Northern BC First Nations Biobank? Essentially, it's a research platform. Research is to figure out today, figure out tomorrow what we don't know today. It's to figure out things so that they can be applied for future people with those kind of conditions. And so it's for our youth, it's for the next generations. Next slide. I love this because it really kind of captures the answer. This is by Angela Gonzalez, who's Hopi from Arizona, and her quote is on the wall of the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indians. And it just says, being an Indian is not about being part something. It is about being part of something. And I can resonate with that because it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of the NBI and to be in these conversations with communities across Northern BC. Next slide. And so we'll finish it off. But I wanted to leave this up. This was on our title page. This is our logo. Clayton Gauthier is the First Nations artist that did this beautiful logo for us. And this is his explanation of where the NBI logo came from. And what I love is, to quote the part, is the middle part between the two faces is a feather. Feathers represent the road of life. Each feather is different and sacred, as all are. Some feathers are small. Some feathers are long. Each strand of hair in the feather are lessons and teachings we need to learn in this life. The middle of the feather is the road we walk. At the tip of the feather is where we all meet when we are done here on Mother Earth. We all have a road to walk. Let's walk together with love and respect, learning the lessons we need for the generations to come. And my thanks to Clayton for all he's taught us, even in the process of doing this logo. So Cynthia, you can either leave this slide up or we can go to the panel. But we'd love to hear your questions, comments. Thank you so much, Chimigwech.
Fantastic, Nadine. Thank you so much for that presentation and everybody on the team that's gathered here today. I really appreciated it. Thank you. One of the big things that struck me towards one of your last slides here, I guess between a question and a comment, was this concept of having our own autonomy over research, and I know that there are so many communities, so many people that still have really strong feelings about research based on the colonial history of the country. And from my understanding, with the governance structure that we've put in place here at this initiative, it really allows Indigenous First Nations people in the North specifically, but it allows our communities to exercise a sense of true kind of self-governance in the way in which we direct research to be used. The piece that I would like to say here is that, we are all aware of First Nations and Indigenous communities that have been, what I would like to say is a strong word, used in research in the past in this country. And I'm really excited about having the possibility of our communities utilizing research in a good way, in a way to further, to impact and improve the health of our next generation of youth coming up.
No, thanks very much, Cole. That's exactly what we're hoping the Northern First Nations Biobank will do, is while we're proceeding with a Northern Biobank, which is a biobank for people in the North to address the inequity of access to people living in Northern Canada, including Northern BC. That biobank won't have any identity in terms of First Nations or not First Nations, Métis or not Métis. It'll be to address, for example, I'll keep using the cancer because that's the area that I work in and that's what we've heard from communities. But say they're collecting colon cancer specimens and data, and there's a researcher that wants to do a colon cancer study, they can do that. But if they want to do colon cancer in First Nations and they have a question around that, well, welcome to the world of Indigenous governance. If you want that question, those individuals that were First Nations that opted for the choice of being part of the Northern First Nations Biobank, then their colon cancer specimens would be in there. But that whole governance process would then set the stage so that if that researcher had that question, not only would they have to pass through the ethical process and the application process to the Northern Biobank, where that First Nations governance chair would be at, but if it even got past that point, they would then need to go through a separate process to be evaluated through the lens of the Indigenous leaders and governance body to say, this is a project that our communities, we think as the governance body of the Northern First Nations Biobank would be, that this would be a project that we think would work. And they, and all the questions in terms of how that will happen, those are the things that the governance, once we pull, right now the governance is of circles, but the names of the individuals aren't there yet. And so we need to go through that proper process and protocols that the FNHA uses. But once we have that in place, those kind of questions about, is that a good research question? Is that a safe research question? Is that a question we want answered? Is that one of our priorities? Well, that governance is going to have to take place. And the other thing is it may actually, those research questions may become more and more from the communities themselves, because they'll have, I hope, a safer place to bring research questions that they can kind of connect with, because this Northern First Nations Biobank was actually discussed in their communities, was talked about at their sub-regional meetings, that they know is something that they own and that they lead.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nadine. One of the other questions that kind of struck me here is, we talk a lot about the Northern, that this project is specific for Northern First Nations. And I was just wondering if there are any, twofold. One, are there any other biobank initiatives specific to Indigenous communities, whether those be First Nations or Inuit, other, in other places in the country? Are there other Indigenous specific biobanks that exist in the country? And if not, are there plans to kind of allow the Northern First Nations Biobank to lead the way for this process of self-actualization for other communities, either in other regions or other specific Indigenous communities?
That's a great question. So this is a biobank that's being created for the purpose of research. So it truly is a biobank. Like right now, not a single research question has been entertained. It's not being created for a specific project. It's being created as a tool for future research. And the answer to the creation of an Indigenous biobank in any, like First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, or combination thereof, to our knowledge, it does not exist in Canada. So there are some examples. well, I know of one example, but I'm sure there's others where there's been research projects that have involved collection of biospecimens and data where they've asked the participants in the future, if there's another research question, can we can we use this for other research? But it wasn't created for the purpose of a biobank. It was created because these individuals like entered into a 5-year study. And actually I work a lot with one of the projects that does that. That has a few communities across the country that are First Nations that do have that sort of data that's been stored for potential future research. But that's not truly a biobank set up for this purpose. But there is a lot of things that we can learn from each other, definitely. And to add to your question about the NBI and the Northern First Nations Biobank, the answer is yes. Like, people across the country are aware of this initiative and are asking, how is it going? What are you learning? And we are sharing what we're learning because, well, you've seen just a portion of the data that we've collected so far. And that's not even the quotes and the advice that we've captured in words. You can only, like, bar graphs and circle graphs, like, they can only show so much. It's the incredible dialogue in these focus groups and in these interviews that are incredibly enriching in terms of what we've learned as a team and those that we've worked with. It's been an amazing experience.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't agree more. I can only imagine. Excuse me. I can only imagine the sort of the fantastic engagement that must have come from these caucuses and these meetings. Patricia, it's so nice to have you join us. I apologize that we weren't able to kind of introduce you before. Thanks very much for coming on to join us for the panel portion of this chat. I just wanted to know if there's anything that you would like to add to that answer regarding the FNHA and their possible kind of future plans, regarding the Northern First Nations Biobank.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cole. I know we've been working really closely with Nadine and the team to have this Northern Biobank set up in a really good way. And we've been working hard on that for a number of years. So appreciate seeing this presentation, Nadine, because that's the culmination of the hard work and the information that we have been asked to share, and what we need. We take our direction from the communities, as you have outlined so clearly with the chiefs and the leadership and the fulsome community engagement process. So I can't speak to how much more there will be. I think this is kind of the conversation that I know Nadine is going to be connecting in with, like, say, Megan Hunt and Richard Jock, and talking about what this means for future. And I believe that's going to be part of what's going to be coming next to outline all of that. And I know Nadine has some great thoughts in her head and ways that she wants to see this coming out. And so whatever we can do to support that will be the goal.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Chongo, Dr. Daneko, did you have anything that you wanted to add to any of these pieces before we move on to another question?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So something was raised in the chat by one of our valued participants about the capacity building with respect to students, Indigenous students. So yeah, we do have, as part of the NBI team from the beginning, from inception, a lot of students, so some of whom are Indigenous. We do encourage them to join from year to year, as they pass through university. And they are so much involved. They were involved in the engagement with the community. Some of them travel to the communities themselves. They are involved even as we speak in we were doing a pamphlet, which is where the logo is also going to be placed. They are involved in knowledge translation. They're involved in the reporting that we'll be doing to FNHA. So yeah, we do encourage that, and we still have them on. And part of the reason is that for the future, we have to make sure, I do like Nadine's slide where there were 2 kids at the end there, where she mentioned that, for future generations, we can't just do something now and drop the ball as we retire. We have to make sure that this is an ongoing process, that everybody understands where it's coming from and where it's going, and that we have those torchbearers going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to the Learning Circle. I would like to add one or 2 points more. What I see in this project, the educational component, the interaction with people and informing the communities, I sincerely hope it will empower, I would like to use this word, empower people and enable them to make decisions on their own without, blindly trusting someone or rejecting something altogether. So the knowledge is the key, education is a key, and people, my job, as I see it, it's not to tell people what to do, but lay the spectrum of facts and in front of them and inform participants to the best of my ability and let them make decision on their own terms based on their own needs. Well, obviously, this project cannot correct the wrongdoings of the past, but what it can and should do is to assure that the things are done properly from now and in the future. And I'm talking about the research. The research should be done with, in my opinion, with indigenous communities as partners, not as study objects. And the third point I would like to make, and I hope I'm right in this, the Northern Biobank will allow Northern communities to control not only what research questions are being studied, but also what happens with their clinical data and with their specimens. If you don't hold it, you don't own it. When the data and materials are stored elsewhere in Vancouver and Abbotsford, no matter what, you have, in reality, you have very little control over what's going on with those materials. But when everything is based here in Prince George, well, here I am, and everybody is interested or everybody concerned can come and talk with me, can come and talk with Nadine. The doors can be open, the people can attend any public events or be part of the project as a community representative. So, control is yours. Control is in your hand now. Thank you.
Beautifully said. Thank you both very much. So there's another question that I have that's kind of it's been bubbling a little bit in my mind for a little while now, and we've talked around it quite a bit, or a little bit in terms of consent and good ways in which we practice this research. And one of my questions is regarding ongoing consent for these sorts of projects and the use of specimens or the removal of specimens. And I think one of the big issues that I can see, or at least from my perspective historically, is Indigenous data being collected for one project and then used for many others with or without consent, degrees of informed consent. And what I mean by that is, they might have been told that there was a research project happening, but had no idea as to what was being used or what their data was being used for. In the event that a community chooses not to participate, how, post donation, let's say, or individuals, are there any protocols in place to address that sort of ongoing participation in the biobank, essentially recognizing that each person's data is their own forevermore? Does anybody have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a common question, but I think it's just, in fairness to the general public, it's just so much more important for First Nations peoples than a standard biobank that you see down in Vancouver. That's for everybody that walks through the door. So from the individual level consent, it's certainly going to be established that that at any point, if you change your mind, there will be a way that the biobank will be able to take your data out of the biobank and take your specimen out of the biobank, and you can change your mind. This is not sort of something that's that once you say yes, isn't that too bad, you can never change your mind again. So there's always going to be the option of changing your mind. And that's really critical because it gives the power and the control to the individual who absolutely, it's their data. And it's their tissue that's there. So that's going to be important. With respect to research, this is a biobank where if you're participating in and you put your specimen in, you don't, right now, it's not a project where you're saying, I'm going to enter this study on diabetes. And okay, you might use my information or my blood sample in the future for something else. This is actually donating it to a biobank where the research questions don't even exist yet. And so it is, and so the question is, how are we going to address that? And that's a big question. That the one thing I think that the NBI team, I think we are very cognizant of is that's actually not a research question. That's not a question that I can answer, even as the principal investigator of the project. It's not something that Dr. Chongo can do because he's a family doctor and it's worked with patients. And it's not something that Victor can do because he's created the biobank and the infrastructure within the actual hospital. It's not, it's something that we really, that's what the governance would do in terms of how are we going to approach that really, really important question. And will need to be answered before the biobank is up and running. In terms of how are we going to do this? Is it consent for each project? Because, and we've heard different things. We've heard, yep, that's what we want. And we've also heard things like, what a nuisance. I said that I want to be part of solutions. I am so sick and tired of, my family history of cancer. I want to, like, don't bother me about this. And so and the range of everything in between. And so there's that part of it versus the governance in terms of, would there be that established circle? Would the process that they create to say yes or no to a research project, would that be a safe way to answer it for First Nations if that circle was made up of all First Nations, researchers, ethicists, lawyers, elders, community members, regional reps that were voted in? Would there be a process of all research officially being presented first at a regional meeting and then having to be processed first there before brought to the governance, where they would answer more of the detailed kind of nuances? All these kind of things have been put on the table. Where it ultimately ends up, that's our next phase, which is really the exciting phase about how is Indigenous governance going to be operationalized? What path are we going to take? I'm excited to hear about it, but I do know, as an Anishinaabe researcher and as an Anishinaabe physician, I have to also remember that my First Nation isn't even in Northern BC. I certainly connect to these communities, and I'm so honored that they would share their stories with me and be part of this project. But I know that my opportunities and the NBI opportunities are a gift. Just because I'm First Nations does not mean that I can even speak for a single nation in Northern BC. So that's going to be an answer coming from leadership and representatives and community members to tell us what they want and what they need.
Very well said, Dr. Karone. Thank you so much. I think I agree. It is really exciting. It's groundbreaking to see Indigenous governance and protocols actualized in a way that's unheard of, really, at least in the research sphere and in health. Let's say public health in general, in Canada at least. So I'm really excited to see the direction in which we go, and yeah, it's going to be beautiful. So thank you very much for that answer. And it is a complex one for sure, in terms of kind of ongoing consent for differing research projects and who's going to opt in or opt out for certain projects or et cetera, right? So that's great. So we're here at the end of our time. I know it was a bit of a I apologize that we weren't able to make a little bit more time for questions. If you have anything else, please fill it into the chat or the Q&A now, and we'll try and address it at the end. What I've heard from today from all of you gathered here is that the Northern Biobank initiative is off to a great start, that we were able to engage communities in a really good way, and that we have a strong governance structure in place to make sure that decisions are made in a good way and in a right way moving forward, which I think is fantastic. I'm really sincerely excited for the future. If you have anything else that you'd like to leave our audience with today, I'd love to pass the mic over to you to do so.
I think I would like to give the last word to Trish as our First Nations Health Authority lead. The NBI team in general just says Chimigwich. Trish, any last thoughts?
No, I just want to thank everybody and thank the team that has been working so tirelessly for the Northern region. So I just want to raise my hands up to you all, and looking forward to this next step and chapter that we're going to embark on together. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody that participated today. We had a really great time and a really engaged conversation. I can see many, many chat comments, people that are really appreciative of the work that has been going on. So thank you all so much. Coming up at the Learning Circle, we have sessions on the safety and efficacy of the ongoing COVID-19 vaccines. We also have some sessions going on with decolonizing sport, cultural safety in acute care settings, and as well as Indigenous futurisms, which should be a very interesting conversation. So tune into those going into February and March. We look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Until then, take care. Bye.
Bye.